Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Unseen Passenger. Alan James was a name known in the aviation industry but rarely seen by the everyday passengers of his airline, Skyglide Airways. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing airlines in the country, Alan was celebrated for his revolutionary policies and people-first approach. However, what most didn't know was his peculiar habit. Every few weeks, Alan would shed the privileges of his title, book a regular economy class ticket under his real name, and board flights just like any other passenger. It was a crisp autumn morning at Atlanta International Airport. The terminal was alive with the hustle and bustle of travelers, some rushing to catch their flights, others leisurely sipping overpriced coffee. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, a pair of faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, Alan blended effortlessly into the crowd. His unassuming appearance was deliberate. He wanted to remain unnoticed, to experience what his passengers did without the bias of special treatment. Alan's gray-flecked hair, a nod to his 54 years, was neatly combed, but not with the polished sheen one might expect of a corporate executive. His laptop bag, made of scuffed leather, bore the marks of countless trips, a symbol of utility over ostentation. To anyone watching, he was just another traveler preparing for a long journey. This morning, his destination was Boston. He had a quarterly board meeting later that week, but today's flight wasn't about business. It was about understanding. Alan believed that the only way to run an airline effectively was to put himself in the shoes of the people who kept his planes full and his profits soaring, the passengers. Over the years, he had learned that no number of executive reports or data analytics could replace the insights gleaned from real-world experience. As Alan made his way through security, he observed the interactions around him. A young TSA agent was meticulously checking IDs, her patience wearing thin as an older man argued about removing his shoes. Nearby, a family struggled to collapse a stroller while juggling backpacks and a squirming toddler. Alan smiled to himself. Travel was the great equalizer. It didn't matter who you were, everyone had to navigate its challenges. After clearing security, he stopped by a coffee stand. The line was long, but Alan didn't mind. It gave him a chance to watch the baristas work under pressure. When his turn came, he ordered a black coffee, no cream, no sugar. He handed over a crumpled bill and pocketed his change, noting the tired but genuine smile the barista offered him. Little did she know, the man she had just served was responsible for her paycheck. With coffee in hand, Alan found a seat near his gate. The waiting area was a microcosm of society, business travelers typing furiously on laptops, vacationers chatting excitedly about their plans, and weary solo flyers scrolling aimlessly through their phones. Alan sipped his coffee and opened his laptop, not to check emails, but to jot down observations. This was his ritual, a way to stay connected to the core of his business. At Gate 23, the flight crew was busy preparing for boarding. Alan's attention was drawn to a gate agent assisting an elderly woman with her boarding pass. The young man's patience and kindness stood out, and Alan made a mental note to commend him through the airline's internal system. Moments like these reaffirmed his belief in the importance of fostering a customer-first culture within the company. As boarding began, Alan's phone buzzed with a notification from the airline app. He had been upgraded to first class, an automatic perk tied to his frequent flyer status. He frowned slightly. He usually preferred to stay in economy to get a more authentic experience, but it was too late to change it now. He resolved to make the most of it by observing the service standards in the premium cabin. When his group was called, Alan joined the line. In front of him, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit was speaking loudly into his phone, complaining about a delayed meeting. Further ahead, a young mother was struggling to calm her crying baby while juggling a diaper bag and a carry-on. Alan leaned forward and spoke gently, "Don't worry. Flights can be overwhelming for little ones, but they usually fall asleep once the plane gets moving." The woman looked back, startled but grateful. "Thank you," she said with a tired smile. Alan smiled back. "I've been there," he said, thinking of his own children, now grown. His daughter was a second-year college student, and his son was a high school freshman. Traveling with them when they were young had been a lesson in patience and adaptability, skills that served him well in his current role. As he walked down the jet bridge, Alan felt a familiar sense of anticipation. Despite decades in the industry, the sight of a plane ready for takeoff still filled him with awe. He nodded to the ground crew performing final checks on the aircraft, appreciating their often overlooked role in ensuring every flight was safe and on schedule. When Alan stepped into the first-class cabin, he was greeted by a flight attendant with a polished smile. She directed him to his seat, and he settled in, storing his bag under the seat in front of him. The cabin was a stark contrast to economy, with its wide seats, plush headrests, and personalized service. Alan took mental notes as the flight attendant offered pre-departure drinks and adjusted the passenger seats. But not all interactions in the cabin were seamless. Across the aisle, another flight attendant, a young woman with striking red lipstick, seemed flustered. Her tone was curt as she spoke to an older couple, and she rolled her eyes when the man asked for a blanket. Alan raised an eyebrow. He believed in holding his staff to high standards of professionalism, and this interaction fell short. As the plane taxied to the runway, Alan settled back in his seat. He looked out the window, watching the ground crew fade into the distance. These moments of anonymity, when he was just another passenger on a journey, were rare and precious. They reminded him why he had chosen this path, why he had worked tirelessly to build an airline that prioritized people over profits. But what Alan didn't know was that this flight would be unlike any other he had taken. It would test his patience, challenge his values, and ultimately reaffirm his belief in the power of humility and respect. This wasn't just a flight to Boston, it was the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. The calm before the storm. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Alan James took a deep breath and glanced around the cabin. First class was comfortably quiet, the hum of the engines providing a soothing background noise. The attendant from earlier, the one with the sharp demeanor and bright red lipstick, was making her way through the aisle, distributing drinks to the passengers. She moved with efficiency but carried an edge to her behavior. Her movements were curt, her smile barely touched her eyes. Alan noted this with mild curiosity. Flight attendants were often the face of the airline, ambassadors for the company's reputation. They were trained to maintain professionalism even in stressful circumstances. Something about her demeanor suggested she was distracted or simply uninterested. For a moment, Alan wondered if she was having a bad day. After all, everyone was allowed one of those now and then. He turned his attention to the screen in front of him and scrolled through the in-flight entertainment, deciding on a documentary about global sustainability. Meanwhile, the flight crew began their first round of service. The other flight attendants moved with practiced grace, smiling as they offered snacks and beverages. Alan watched carefully as passengers interacted with the crew. The majority were satisfied, but he spotted a few eye rolls and sighs exchanged when the attendant with red lipstick, whose name tag read Kelsey, tended to them. Her responses were clipped, her tone verging on irritation. Across the aisle from Alan, an elderly man with thin silver hair flagged her down. His voice was soft, kind. "Excuse me, miss, could I trouble you for an extra glass of water?" Kelsey stopped, her tray balanced expertly in one hand. She gave the older gentleman a look that could freeze water. "Sir, I've already served you once." "I'll come back when I've finished with the others," she said curtly before moving on. The man blinked, clearly taken aback. He slumped back in his seat and murmured to his wife, "I just wanted some water." Alan frowned. His instincts sharpened. There was a clear issue here, and while it wasn't his place to intervene yet, he made a mental note to observe further. Years of working from the ground up had taught him one thing: it's the little cracks that reveal the true state of an organization. As the hours progressed, about an hour into the flight, the turbulence began. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to make passengers grip their armrests and abandon their drinks. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin as the plane gently rocked. The pilot's calm voice reassured the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a small pocket of rough air. We'll be out of it shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Alan, unbothered by the turbulence, took this opportunity to stretch his legs. He stood, nodded politely to the passengers around him, and made his way toward the restroom at the front of the cabin. He passed Kelsey on the way back. She was leaning against the galley counter, whispering something to another flight attendant, who nodded solemnly. Alan didn't think much of it, until he saw the way Kelsey's gaze flicked toward him and narrowed. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but something in her eyes gave him pause. The incident. After returning to his seat, Alan noticed a young black man entering the cabin from economy, holding what looked like a small medical bag. His expression was nervous as he spoke to a flight attendant near the galley. Alan didn't hear the entire conversation, but snippets drifted over the hushed cabin. "I'm a nurse. I think someone in the back needs help," the young man was explaining. Kelsey, who had appeared beside the other attendant, crossed her arms. "Sir, passengers aren't allowed to wander into first class. Please return to your seat." The nurse's face fell. "I just need someone to let me." "I said return to your seat," Kelsey snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. "We'll handle it." A ripple of murmurs spread across the passengers. Alan's brow furrowed as he watched the young man, clearly uncomfortable and unsure, turn and walk back toward economy. Alan had seen enough. This was more than a bad day. He reached for the small notepad he kept in his bag and jotted down a few notes. Poor attitude toward passengers. Dismissive. Failure to de-escalate. Moments later, Alan's focus shifted again when Kelsey reappeared, this time pushing the drink cart. The turbulence had passed, and the cabin was settling down. She approached Alan's row, a forced smile on her face. "Would you like anything to drink, sir?" she asked flatly. "Water, please," Alan said politely. He wanted nothing more than to avoid drawing attention to himself, but it seemed today wasn't going to allow that. It happened in the blink of an eye. As Kelsey poured the water, her elbow accidentally knocked the tray. A glass of orange juice that was sitting on it tipped forward, splashing directly onto Alan's lap and across his sweater. The cold liquid soaked through the fabric, shocking him to attention. "Oh," Kelsey said, though her tone lacked genuine apology. "I'm so sorry." But the smirk that flickered across her lips for a split second told a different story. Passengers nearby gasped. A woman across the aisle pulled her phone closer to her face, perhaps already typing about the incident on social media. Alan's hands gripped the arms of his seat as he stared at the juice dripping from his sweater. "Let me get some napkins," Kelsey said, her voice dripping with mock concern. She handed him a single, flimsy napkin before pushing the cart further down the aisle. As if nothing had happened. Alan blinked, shock slowly giving way to a calm, simmering resolve. He wasn't angry, not yet. But he was disappointed. Disappointed in the treatment he had witnessed, in the lack of care, and in the reality that someone representing his airline had conducted themselves this way. Nearby passengers were whispering now, their gazes darting toward him. A businessman 2 rows back muttered, "Unbelievable." The older couple from earlier looked at Alan sympathetically, the gentleman shaking his head. Alan removed his sweater, revealing the plain white t-shirt underneath. He folded the damp garment and set it on his lap, looking straight ahead. Years of leadership had taught him patience, and years on the ground had shown him how to pick his battles. This wasn't the time or place to make a scene, but the flight wasn't over yet. The tension builds. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew uneasy. Passengers avoided eye contact with Kelsey, and even her colleagues seemed hesitant to interact with her. Alan sat quietly, observing everything, absorbing every detail. What Kelsey didn't know, what no one on the plane knew, was who Alan James really was. Today, he wasn't just a passenger soaked in orange juice. He was the man who signed their paychecks, who oversaw every aspect of the airline's operations, and who believed that respect, dignity, and service were non-negotiable principles. And before this flight landed, Kelsey was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The mask begins to crack. The incident with the juice might have seemed minor to a casual observer, but to Alan James, it was more than an unfortunate accident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that he had spent years trying to eliminate from the airline industry. Disrespectful, unprofessional behavior like this eroded customer trust and tarnished reputations. Alan sat quietly, a moment of reflection. Back in his seat, Alan observed Kelsey's behavior from afar. Her body language told him everything he needed to know. She was tense, irritable, and disengaged from her duties. Over the years, Alan had seen countless employees like her. Some could be retrained, guided back to their original passion for the job. Others, well, they were not cut out for an industry built on patience and service. Alan looked out the window, the world below obscured by thick clouds. He thought back to his days as a baggage handler, hauling suitcases in the freezing cold, and then as a gate agent, dealing with angry passengers when flights were delayed. He'd faced plenty of bad days himself, but what mattered wasn't the frustration, it was how you treated people in spite of it. He glanced toward the front galley, where Kelsey was speaking quietly to another flight attendant. Her posture was rigid, her tone sharp. Alan made another note in his small notepad: observation, attitude shift. Poor handling of in-flight issue. Lack of customer focus. The wheels were turning in his head. This wasn't just about Kelsey. It was about accountability. Skyglide Airways had built its reputation on treating customers with dignity, a philosophy Alan had fought hard to implement. If this was happening here, in first class, what was happening elsewhere? An unexpected intervention. A soft commotion near the front of the cabin pulled Alan's attention. A woman in economy had stepped forward, holding her crying infant in one arm. She looked exhausted, her face flushed with stress. "Excuse me," she said nervously, "I was wondering if I could stand here for a minute? My baby won't stop crying, and I didn't want to disturb everyone." Kelsey appeared, her arms crossed and her expression pinched. "Ma'am, you can't just stand in the galley. Please return to your seat." The woman hesitated. "I just need a moment. He gets fussy sometimes." "I said no," Kelsey snapped. "This area is for crew only." Alan's expression hardened. Before he could intervene, Maria, the senior flight attendant, stepped in. "Ma'am, it's all right. Come here, you can stand for a minute." She turned to Kelsey and gave her a pointed look. "I'll handle this." The young mother gave Maria a grateful smile. "Thank you so much." Kelsey turned on her heel and stormed into the galley, muttering something Alan couldn't hear. He frowned. This wasn't just a bad day, this was a pattern. The reveal begins. About 30 minutes before landing, the captain's voice came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Boston shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and trays are in their upright positions." Kelsey returned to the cabin to collect trash and prepare for landing. As she passed Alan, she avoided eye contact. It was clear she wanted this flight to end as much as anyone. But Alan wasn't finished yet. When Kelsey stopped near his row to collect trash, Alan handed her his empty water cup and spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Excuse me, miss. I'd like to know your full name." Kelsey froze, her expression flickering between surprise and irritation. "Why do you need to know that?" Alan didn't raise his voice, but his gaze was steady. "I believe I'll need to speak to someone about today's service." A silence fell over the cabin. Passengers nearby turned to look, sensing the tension. Kelsey's face paled. "I already apologized about the juice," she said defensively. Alan raised an eyebrow. "This isn't just about the juice." Maria, overhearing the exchange, quickly approached. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone diplomatic. Alan offered Maria a small, reassuring smile. "Yes, thank you. I just needed to clarify something." Kelsey shot Alan a look that could burn through steel, then stormed toward the galley without another word. A lesson in accountability. As the plane descended, Alan felt the shift in pressure, but remained focused on what would come next. Kelsey had no idea who she had been serving, or mistreating, for the last 3 hours. She would soon learn the truth, and it would be a moment she wouldn't forget. What Kelsey failed to understand was this: respect and humility were non-negotiable, no matter the circumstances. And for Alan James, CEO of Skyglide Airways, this flight was no longer just an observation, it was a reminder of why he had fought so hard to build a company that valued its passengers and its employees. The landing gear lowered, the engines roared, and as the aircraft touched down on the runway, Alan sat back and prepared for what came next. Kelsey's mask of professionalism had cracked, and soon, she would come face to face with the consequences of her actions. The truth lands hard. The wheels of the aircraft touched down with a slight jolt, followed by the familiar roar of the engines reversing. The passengers breathed a collective sigh of relief as the plane slowed on the runway, signaling the end of the flight. Alan remained composed, his thoughts calm but determined as the cabin began buzzing with the sounds of people gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Kelsey was back at the front of the first-class cabin, her posture stiff as she made the routine announcements over the PA system. Her tone was no longer sharp but robotic. Clearly, she just wanted the flight to be over. Alan quietly folded his orange-stained sweater and placed it back in his bag. Despite everything, his expression remained neutral, betraying none of the thoughts racing through his mind. The passengers in first class rose from their seats and began to file toward the front of the cabin. The elderly man who'd been denied water gave Alan a sympathetic smile as he passed by. "Good luck with that one," he whispered with a nod in Kelsey's direction. Alan smiled faintly and gave a polite nod in return. As Alan stood, Maria, the senior flight attendant, approached him with a kind but concerned look. "Sir, I noticed the incident earlier," she said quietly. "I hope everything was satisfactory in the end?" Alan appreciated her professional attempt to smooth things over. "Thank you, Maria," he replied warmly. "Your service was excellent, as always." He deliberately made his voice loud enough for Kelsey to hear from the galley. Maria's face relaxed into a relieved smile, and she moved back to assist passengers. Meanwhile, Kelsey remained frozen near the exit door, her forced smile plastered on her face as she thanked passengers for flying Skyglide Airways. Her body language spoke volumes: defensive, impatient, and closed off. When Alan finally approached her, Kelsey's smile faltered, but she quickly covered it up. "Thank you for flying with us," she said mechanically, avoiding eye contact. Alan paused, tilting his head slightly. "You're welcome," he replied evenly. Then, with an almost imperceptible smile, he added, "I'm sure we'll talk again soon." Kelsey blinked, startled by the cryptic remark, but Alan was already walking up the jet bridge. The reveal. By the time Alan entered the terminal, the crowd had thinned. He strode confidently toward the airline's operations desk, where a manager named Craig Thompson stood chatting with a ground crew member. Craig was a tall, stocky man in his early 40s, with a well-kept uniform and a friendly demeanor. He had worked with Alan for years, and though Alan typically traveled incognito, Craig always recognized him instantly. The moment Craig's eyes landed on Alan, his face lit up with a mixture of surprise and professional respect. "Mr. James," he exclaimed, lowering his voice and extending a hand. "I didn't know you were flying today. How was the trip?" Alan shook his hand firmly, offering a polite but pointed smile. "Eventful, Craig," he said. "Very eventful." Craig's brows furrowed with concern. "Was there an issue, sir?" Alan nodded once. "I'd like to debrief with you and your cabin crew supervisor as soon as possible. Specifically about the service in first class." The gravity in Alan's tone made Craig straighten his posture. He understood that if the CEO of Skyglide Airways was taking personal notice of something, it was serious. "Of course, Mr. James. I'll arrange it immediately." The waiting room. While Craig made arrangements, Alan sat in a private lounge reserved for airline executives and staff. He sipped a fresh cup of coffee, his mind clear and focused. The memories of the flight replayed in his head, Kelsey's dismissive attitude toward the nurse, her sharpness with the young mother, her indifference to spilling juice on him. Alan wasn't angry, anger was unproductive. What concerned him more deeply was the fact that this behavior was allowed to happen at all. Were other employees suffering from burnout or frustration like Kelsey? Was there a flaw in the airline's training? Had supervisors failed to identify and address staff members who were unfit for the job? These were the questions that mattered to him. The juice spill was insignificant compared to the bigger picture, Skyglide's reputation and its promise of excellent service to every passenger. The confrontation. 30 minutes later, Craig returned, flanked by Melissa Diaz, the regional cabin crew supervisor, a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Behind her, looking markedly less confident, was Kelsey. Her usual sharpness had been replaced with visible anxiety, though she tried to mask it with a professional expression. "Mr. James," Melissa said warmly as she shook Alan's hand. "I understand you requested a meeting. How can we assist?" Alan gestured for them to sit at the table. Kelsey hesitated before taking a seat, fidgeting with the edge of her uniform sleeve. First, Alan began calmly, addressing Melissa, "I want to thank you and your team for the hard work you do every day. I've flown thousands of miles on our airline, and I know what it takes to keep things running smoothly." Melissa nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Alan turned his gaze toward Kelsey, whose face paled slightly under his steady stare. "I also had the privilege of observing today's flight firsthand," he continued. "And unfortunately, there were several things I found concerning." Kelsey's fingers tightened on her lap. "Can you tell me, Ms. Carter," Alan said, his voice soft but firm, "why you denied an elderly man an extra glass of water? Or why you spoke sharply to a young mother, simply looking for a moment of comfort for her child?" Kelsey's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She glanced at Melissa for help, but the supervisor's expression was unreadable. "And lastly," Alan continued, "can you explain why, when you spilled juice on me, not realizing who I was, you failed to offer even a basic apology?" Kelsey finally found her voice, though it trembled. I didn't mean any harm. It was an accident, sir. I was having a rough day." Alan's gaze softened just slightly. "We all have rough days, Ms. Carter. I've had plenty myself. But having a bad day doesn't give us the right to treat people poorly, especially when we're in a position of service. Do you agree?" Kelsey swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir." Melissa broke the silence. "Mr. James, I take full responsibility for this. It's clear that there's an issue here, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately." Alan nodded. "I trust that it will, Melissa. My goal here isn't to punish anyone, it's to ensure this doesn't happen again. Every passenger deserves respect, regardless of who they are or what class they're seated in. That's the standard we set at Skyglide Airways." Kelsey's eyes fell to the table. Her defensiveness had faded, replaced with what looked like genuine remorse. "I'm sorry, Mr. James," she said quietly. "I let my frustration get the better of me. I promise I'll do better." Alan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I hope you do, Ms. Carter. The choice to improve is yours to make, and I encourage you to take it seriously." Melissa stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Thank you, Mr. James. I'll follow up with you personally." As the group dispersed, Alan watched Kelsey walk away, her shoulders slightly hunched. He didn't take pleasure in these moments, but he understood their necessity. Growth only happened when mistakes were acknowledged, addressed, and learned from. A lesson learned. That evening, as Alan sat in his Boston hotel room, he reflected on the events of the day. He knew that Kelsey's story wasn't unique. There would always be employees who lost sight of their purpose. What mattered was how the company responded, and how leaders like himself guided them back to the core values that defined Skyglide Airways. The next morning, Alan received an email from Melissa. Kelsey had been placed in an intensive retraining program, and additional coaching for all flight attendants had been scheduled to reinforce Skyglide's commitment to customer service. Alan smiled faintly. Small steps led to big changes. A ripple of change. The Boston morning sun broke through the curtains of Alan James' hotel room, casting long golden streaks on the floor. Alan sat at the small desk near the window, sipping a fresh cup of coffee while reading through his emails. A detailed follow-up from Melissa Diaz had come through overnight. She provided a full report of the previous day's incident, along with the corrective actions being taken to address not just Kelsey's behavior, but the culture of accountability across the cabin crew teams. Accountability in action. Melissa's email outlined several steps. Kelsey Carter had been formally placed in a customer service retraining program. The program included empathy workshops, conflict de-escalation exercises, and refresher courses on Skyglide's values of respect, dignity, and care. Team refocus training. Within 2 weeks, Melissa would organize regional seminars for all flight attendants to highlight customer-first values, reiterating Skyglide's commitment to passengers. It wasn't just about professional skills, it was about cultivating a mindset of respect and patience, even in difficult moments. Employee support systems. Recognizing that stress and burnout were underlying issues, Melissa also proposed an internal support program for employees struggling with the pressures of airline work. Counseling, peer mentorship, and additional resources would be provided to help team members navigate personal and professional challenges. Alan's eyes lingered on this last point. It was easy to reprimand an employee for poor performance, but great leadership meant identifying the root cause. Kelsey's attitude was unacceptable, yes, but Alan suspected her behavior stemmed from burnout, unchecked frustration, and a lack of mentorship. Alan closed the email and leaned back in his chair. Small changes could create powerful ripples, and he knew Melissa's steps would lead to a healthier, more compassionate culture for both employees and customers. Good work, Melissa, Alan murmured, making a mental note to call her later to personally thank her for her leadership. The CEO's surprise visit. 3 days later, Alan stood outside Skyglide Airways Crew Operations Center at Boston Logan Airport. He had cleared his schedule that morning for an impromptu visit. It was his style, show up without fanfare, without announcement. He wanted to see the day-to-day workings of his teams as they really were. Dressed in his usual low-key attire, jeans, a navy sweater, and his well-worn leather laptop bag, Alan walked through the doors. The crew center buzzed with activity. Flight attendants and pilots prepared for their routes, organizing manifests, reviewing safety protocols, and chatting in small groups over coffee. As Alan passed by, a few employees recognized him, quiet nods of respect or wide-eyed stares followed in his wake. Alan was well known among his staff for his hands-on approach, but his unexpected visits always caught them by surprise. "Morning, Mr. James," a young flight attendant named Tina called cheerfully, her voice laced with nervous excitement. Alan smiled warmly. "Morning, Tina. Where are you headed today?" "San Francisco, sir," she replied, straightening her posture. "Safe travels," Alan said, moving deeper into the room. In one corner of the crew center, Alan spotted Melissa Diaz, clipboard in hand, briefing a small group of flight attendants about upcoming service improvements. Her commanding presence and calm tone reassured the group. Standing slightly apart from the others, Alan saw someone who made him pause. Kelsey Carter. She looked different, humbled, quieter, her sharp edges softened. The arrogance that had marked her demeanor on the flight was gone, replaced by a focused attentiveness. She listened closely to Melissa's words, occasionally nodding and taking notes. Alan waited until the briefing ended before approaching. Melissa noticed him immediately and smiled. "Mr. James, good to see you." "Likewise, Melissa. Mind if I have a quick word with Kelsey?" Melissa nodded. "Of course, sir." Kelsey looked up sharply as her name was mentioned, her face paling when she saw Alan approaching. She straightened her shoulders, clearly bracing for the worst. "Good morning, Kelsey," Alan said in his calm, measured tone. "Good morning, Mr. James," she replied softly. Alan gestured to a nearby table. Let's sit for a moment, shall we? They sat down across from each other. For a moment, there was silence. Kelsey's hands fidgeted in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between Alan and the table. I wanted to check in, Alan began, his voice steady but kind. Melissa tells me you've started retraining. Yes, sir, Kelsey replied quickly. I've been going through the workshops, and I understand where I went wrong. I'm really trying to do better. Alan studied her for a long moment, his gaze kind but unyielding. It's not easy admitting our mistakes, Kelsey. But what matters is how we learn from them. She swallowed hard. I didn't realize how much my attitude was affecting people. I was frustrated, but that's no excuse. I let it get the better of me. Alan nodded. I appreciate your honesty. Frustration happens. Burnout happens. But when you're representing this airline, every passenger interaction counts, every single one. It's not just about policies or checklists. It's about showing people kindness, dignity, and respect. Kelsey blinked, her eyes glistening slightly. I understand that now, sir. I really do. I want to make it right. Alan offered a small, approving smile. Good. Because I believe in second chances. Kelsey. You have the opportunity to turn this around, not just for the airline, but for yourself. Kelsey exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Thank you, Mr. James. I won't let you down. I'll be keeping an eye on your progress, Alan said, his tone encouraging. Make the most of this chance. Kelsey nodded firmly, determination lighting up her expression. I will. The ripple effect. Over the following months, Alan watched with quiet satisfaction as Melissa's initiatives began to transform Skyglide's cabin crew culture. Reports of passenger satisfaction improved steadily, and employee morale rose alongside it. Flight attendants like Kelsey, those who once struggled with burnout or frustration, found renewed purpose through better training and mentorship. Kelsey, in particular, became a quiet success story. She took the retraining program to heart and emerged as a more patient, compassionate flight attendant. Passengers began leaving positive comments about her service, small notes of gratitude that were shared company-wide. A final flight. 6 months after the Boston incident, Alan once again found himself on a Skyglide Airways flight, traveling incognito. He was seated in economy this time, observing as he always did. Midway through the flight, a flight attendant stopped beside his row. Would you like a drink, sir? Alan looked up and recognized her instantly. It was Kelsey Carter. Her smile was warm, her voice genuine. Yes, water, please, Alan said with a faint smile. As Kelsey poured the water, she looked him in the eye and said softly, Thank you, sir. For believing in second chances. Alan's smile widened just slightly. Keep up the good work, Kelsey. She nodded, then moved gracefully down the aisle, tending to other passengers with kindness and care. As Alan leaned back in his seat, he felt a deep sense of pride, not just in Kelsey's growth, but in the culture of accountability and empathy that Skyglide Airways was built upon. The small cracks had been repaired. The ripple of change had spread. And in the end, respect and kindness had won.